The first time Enoch Adeboye tasted Lagos, it wasn't with his eyes, it was with his throat. Picture this: a packed Danfo bus, coughing black smoke, bodies pressed tight, sweat mixing with the sour stench of gutters that carry. Yesterday's leftovers, rotting fruit, diesel, and things people don't like to name. A man's elbow keeps jabbing your ribs. Someone's breath is warm and too close. A hawker's hand slides past your face holding meat on a stick. Still glistening, still suspicious, flies doing circles like they've been invited. And in the middle of that mess, there's a quiet young lecturer. Clean shirt, thin frame, calm eyes, holding a small stack of papers like they're a shield. He isn't praying. Not yet. He's doing something more dangerous. He's calculating. Because that young man is Enoch Adeboye, born in 1942, from a tiny Yoruba town where the night is so dark you can almost touch it, and where greatness usually means you survived, not conquered. Survived. And on that bus, he's carrying the weapon that will eventually make Nigeria bow its head. First in respect, then in awe, and for some people, in fear. You came for the life of Pastor Enoch Adeboye, Redeemed Christian Church of God, the man millions call Daddy G. Oh, and yes, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. But stay with me, because the road from a village boy with dust on his ankles to a global spiritual giant is not a clean, shiny miracle story. It's a knife fight between two futures. On one side, the cold, elegant world of numbers. Logic, proof, certainty, control. On the other, the wild, unpredictable world of faith. Voices, visions, surrender, risk. And the enemy in this story doesn't show up with horns. It shows up as a rival version of Adeboye himself, one that whispers, be reasonable, be safe, be admired, don't be that. Because long before he became a pastor, people travel across oceans to see, he was chasing a different crown. He was chasing the kind of respect that doesn't require you to raise your hands or close your eyes. The respect that comes when a room goes quiet because your mind is sharp enough to cut through anyone's argument. The kind of respect you earn with chalk dust on your fingers, not anointing oil on your forehead. But the place he was born didn't care about genius. It cared about food. If you've never lived where scarcity is normal, let me translate it. In a poor, rural Nigerian home in the 1940s and 50s, childhood isn't a cute phase. It's a negotiation. With hunger. With fees. With the unspoken math of survival, how far can we stretch this meal, this coin, this hope? Adeboye grows up in a world where education can feel like a rumor. Something other families get, like good shoes and meat on ordinary days. Yet he's not the loud kind of gifted kid. He's not the show-off. He's the type who watches, listens, learns. The kind of boy who can sit with a problem longer than anyone else and not get bored. That trait, right there, is the first seed. Because later, when faith asks him to wait, when leadership asks him to endure insults, pressure, impossible expectations, he already has the muscle for it. Patience. Trained by necessity. But patience alone doesn't lift you out of a village. You need a door. For him, the door is school. The idea that a boy from a small town can rise, not by bloodline, not by bribery, not by connections, but by sheer mental force. In Nigeria, that's not just ambition, that's rebellion. And he leans into it. He studies the way some people pray, fully, obsessively, like his life depends on it. Because it does. He pushes through exams, through long walks, through the quiet shame of not having what others have. You can imagine him watching classmates pull out neat lunches while he swallows saliva and tells himself, later. I'll eat later. You can imagine him hearing laughter at his worn clothes and translating it into fuel. Not rage, focus. And the more he climbs academically, the more the world changes around him. Nigeria itself is transforming. Cities swelling, opportunity glinting in the distance like heat on asphalt, and also danger multiplying in the shadows. The country is young, restless, loud. There's power in the air, but also instability. The kind of environment where brilliant people can rise fast and fall faster. So when Adeboye moves from village life into higher education, he enters a new ecosystem, one with its own gods, prestige, titles, publications, applause. It's seductive because it's measurable. Faith says, trust. Academia says, prove it. And Enoch Adeboye, young, disciplined, serious, falls in love with proof. Mathematics becomes his language for the universe. It's clean. It's honest. It doesn't flatter you. It doesn't care who your father is. In math, if you're right, you're right. If you're wrong, you're wrong. No tribe can vote you into correctness. That fairness is intoxicating. He keeps advancing until he becomes what many dream of. A scholar, a lecturer, a man headed toward the peak of intellectual respect. This is the path that makes parents beam and neighbors stop doubting you. It's the path that says, he made it. And then comes the first twist. Sometimes, the very thing that rescues you from poverty becomes the chain that tries to keep you from your destiny. Because as Adeboye's mind rises, something else begins to itch under the surface. Something he can't solve on a blackboard. There's a restlessness that numbers can't silence. The kind of quiet question that doesn't show up in exams. Is this it? Not, is this good? Because it is good. Not, is this impressive? Because it is impressive. But is this it? It's the most dangerous question a successful person can ask. And he's not asking it in a vacuum. He's asking it in a Nigeria where spiritual hunger is as real as physical hunger. Where people move between churches, mosques, and traditional practices not as a hobby but as a survival strategy. Where some families will take a sick child to a hospital and a prayer house on the same day because they refuse to gamble on only one reality. In that world, religion is not just belief. It's atmosphere. Still, Adeboye's early life doesn't read like the origin story of a man destined for a pulpit. If anything, he seems built to be the opposite. Cautious, analytical, not a natural performer. He isn't the flamboyant, microphone-thumping stereotype. He's a thinker, a teacher, a man who prefers clarity over noise, which raises the next tension. If you were God, if you wanted to build a movement that would spread across continents, would you choose the loudest man in the room? Or would you choose the quiet one everyone underestimates? Because underestimation is a kind of camouflage. In his youth, Adeboye learns what it means to be overlooked. Poor village boy, serious student, not flashy, not connected. In a society that often rewards volume, that kind of person can be invisible. And invisibility has a hidden advantage. It lets you watch the room. So he watches. He watches people chase power. He watches men reinvent themselves the moment they get a title. He watches how crowds can be manipulated, politically, socially, spiritually. He watches the hunger behind people's eyes, the desperation that makes them cling to anything that promises relief. He watches the way faith can lift someone, and the way it can also be used to trap them. And somewhere in him, without fanfare, a principle forms. If I ever speak to crowds, I must not play with them. That principle matters later, because Nigeria is no stranger to religious showmanship. People have seen miracle sellers, spiritual opportunists, men who turn holy words into personal empires. The public is not naive. They might be devout, but they're not stupid. So why do so many Nigerians still honor Adeboye? Why do millions treat him not as a celebrity, but as a spiritual father? We'll get there. But first you have to understand what almost stopped him. The competitor in his life wasn't another preacher at first. It was the version of success he could touch. Think about it. If you're a young Nigerian academic rising through the ranks, you're tasting a rare kind of stability. You're not guessing where your next meal comes from. You're respected. You're invited into rooms your childhood neighbors will never enter. You're building a legacy. People can't easily insult. And then someone comes along and says, come to church. Not a fancy cathedral, not a glamorous stage. A church movement that, at the time, is not the giant global brand it later becomes. A church with strict holiness roots, prayer meetings, long services, older hymns, and a moral seriousness that doesn't care about your degrees. To an ambitious academic, that invitation can feel like an insult, like being asked to trade a laboratory for a street corner. So imagine the inner dialogue. I worked too hard to be poor again. I worked too hard to be laughed at. I worked too hard to step backward. That voice, the voice of self-protection, is not evil. It's understandable. It's the voice that kept him alive. But destiny rarely arrives politely. Sometimes destiny arrives like a disruption, like a rude knock at the door, like a problem you can't solve with the tools you love. And while Adeboye is building a career, Nigeria itself is building pressure. Cities are swelling. Money is uneven. Hope is sharp and fragile. People are searching for anchors, something steady in the middle of chaos. In moments like that, spiritual leaders don't just preach. They stabilize. They frighten. They inspire. They influence elections and economies without ever holding office. Adeboye is still young, still on the academic track, but the stage is being set around him like a trap he doesn't see. Because here's another twist. His personality, quiet, disciplined, consistent, is exactly the kind of personality that, in a chaotic environment, begins to look like holiness. Where others are dramatic, he is steady. Where others brag, he shrinks. Where others threaten, he persuades. And in Nigeria, that steadiness reads as power. But we're not at power yet. We're still at formation. So let's go back to the boy again, because the boy is where the future pastor begins. One of the most haunting things about poverty is not hunger. It's limitation. When you're poor, you don't just lack money, you lack options. You can't casually explore who you might become. You can't afford mistakes. You can't afford to find yourself. You are forced to pick a path that pays off. That's why Adeboye's devotion to education is not just noble, it's strategic. Education becomes his escape route, not in a romantic sense, in a tactical sense, like plotting a prison break with a pencil and a calendar. He learns to endure discomfort without complaint. He learns to respect structure. He learns to delay gratification. Those traits, in another life, could make him a ruthless corporate executive. Instead, they will make him something far stranger, a man who can fast, pray, travel, lead, and keep showing up year after year until a movement becomes an empire of faith. But if you asked young Adeboye, will you become a pastor? He might have frowned at you like you'd asked if he planned to become the moon. Because his early identity is built on reason, and reason becomes his shield against the irrational parts of life, superstition, fear, spiritual intimidation. In many communities, people grow up hearing stories of curses, witches, spirits, explanations for misfortune that can feel both terrifying and unavoidable. A mind trained in mathematics wants no part of vague fear. It wants clarity. So he runs toward clarity. And here comes a key emotional image. The chalkboard. Chalkboard logic is merciless. You either demonstrate the theorem, or you don't. You can't cry your way into correctness. You can't dance your way into proof. You stand there, exposed, and your mind either holds or collapses. That training does something to a man. It makes him allergic to nonsense, which means, ironically, that when he finally steps into the world of faith, he doesn't do it as a gullible dreamer. He does it as a skeptic who wants to see if this God can withstand scrutiny. And that's the seed of why people later trust him. He doesn't sound like a performer. He sounds like someone who weighed the cost. But that trust is in the future. Right now, the young lecturer's life is narrowing into a single obvious story. Village boy becomes academic star. Nigeria applauds. Family proud. Stability achieved. Until the day the story gets interrupted by something that doesn't care about obvious. A meeting. An invitation. A door opening into a world where people pray as if prayer is a weapon. And somewhere in that world is the Redeemed Christian Church of God, RCCG, not yet the global giant it becomes, but already carrying a certain spiritual intensity, holiness, discipline, prayer, and the kind of faith that asks you to surrender control. Control. That word is the dagger in this story. Because the person Adeboye is competing against, the rival that threatens to win, loves control, loves predictability, loves status, loves the clean certainty of being Dr. Adeboye, the mathematician. But the other future, the one that will make Nigeria honor him, requires him to do something that feels almost disgusting to a proud, educated mind. To kneel, to admit there are questions he can't solve, to become small on purpose. And for a man who climbed out of poverty by refusing to be small, this is not a simple spiritual decision. It is a humiliation. So when the spiritual pull begins, it doesn't arrive like fireworks. It arrives like pressure, like a persistent hand on the shoulder, like a quiet thought that keeps returning no matter how many lectures he teaches. You can ignore a lot of things in life, but you can't ignore a calling that knows your name. And in the next stretch of the story, that calling is going to corner him, not with romance, but with confrontation, with moments that force him to choose which version of himself survives. The academic, crowned by proof, or the servant crowned by surrender. And when he chooses, it will not only change him, it will eventually change the map of Christianity in Nigeria and the way millions of Nigerians understand spiritual authority, discipline, and power. The invitation didn't arrive with angels. It arrived the way most life-changing things arrive in Lagos, casually, almost carelessly, like someone tossing a match near a fuel, spill and walking away as if nothing could possibly happen. "Come with me," the person said, just once. Adeboye didn't want to, not because he hated God. At that point, God was still a concept, a cultural background noise, a word people used when they didn't have better explanations. No. He didn't want to because he could already imagine the scene. Hot air thick with bodies, long prayers that looped like broken records. People crying too loudly, people pretending too loudly, the spiritual theatrics that intelligent men privately mock. And yes, there was also something nastier in the back of his mind. The fear of being associated with the wrong kind of people. Because nothing threatens a young academic's ego like being seen in a room where nobody cares about your credentials. Still, he went. Not because his heart was soft, because his mind was curious. He walked into a gathering that didn't look like power. No polished stage, no expensive suits flashing like armor, more like a furnace of human need, faces tense, hands raised, voices climbing and collapsing, sweat shining on foreheads as if the building itself was breathing. The smell was not pleasant. If you've never been in a packed Nigerian prayer meeting, let me paint it properly. Heat, perfume, damp fabric, and the metallic edge of emotion. People crying, yes, but also people bargaining with heaven. Do it for my child. Do it for my marriage. Do it for my rent. Do it or I don't know what I'll become. It can be hard to watch. It can even be ugly. Because desperation is ugly. And Adeboye, trained by chalkboard logic, was standing inside that ugliness like a man inspecting a strange animal. But then something happened that didn't fit his categories. Not a magic trick. Not a loud miracle. Something quieter, more disturbing in its own way. He felt seen. Not socially seen, spiritually exposed. Like the room had eyes that weren't human. Like the neat, controlled life he'd built, lectures, proofs, schedules, was suddenly thin paper in the rain. And for a man who'd survived poverty by controlling every controllable thing, that sensation wasn't comforting. It was offensive. It was like someone reaching into his chest with dirty hands. So he did what proud men do when they feel threatened by something they can't dominate. He resisted. He didn't become religious overnight. He didn't suddenly start speaking in mystical slogans. He went home with the same disciplined walk, the same rational posture, but now there was a question inside him that would not shut up. What if the world is bigger than my proof? That question is not gentle. It's a parasite. It eats certainty, and the more he tried to push it away, the more it grew teeth. In those days, his life had two gravitational pulls. By day, the respectable world of academia, papers, students, colleagues, the steady ladder of reputation. By night, the echo of that prayer room, Raw voices, trembling hope, people acting as if God was not a metaphor, but a force. He could have dismissed it as mass psychology. Many educated people do. But something kept interfering with his dismissal. The changes he couldn't quite explain in people who were not pretending. People who became calmer. People who stopped drinking themselves to death. People who apologized to families they'd shattered. People who carried hardship with a different kind of spine. Adeboye noticed results. And results are dangerous to skeptics because results demand investigation. So he returned, not as a believer, more like a scientist returning to a strange experiment. And that's how the trap closed. Because the redeemed Christian Church of God, the space he was moving toward, was not built on hype. It was built on discipline, holiness. The kind of faith that doesn't just want you to feel good, it wants to change you. And change is not polite. Change is invasive. When Adeboye met the man who would become his spiritual father, Josiah Olufemi Akindayomi, he didn't meet a flashy celebrity. He met a figure with an almost uncomfortable seriousness. A man rooted in Yoruba culture, rooted in prayer, rooted in a strict understanding of obedience. There's a detail that matters here, because it becomes symbolic of Adeboye's entire journey. Language. Akindayomi preached in Yoruba. Adeboye, educated, precise, comfortable in English, stood between worlds. And at first he was useful in a very specific way. He could translate. Imagine it. The scholar who wanted respect, now standing slightly behind an older preacher, turning Yoruba fire into English sentences for a mixed crowd. Not the main character, not the star, the interpreter. A man who had trained to speak and be listened to, reduced to repeating someone else's words. If you're looking for the moment where his pride got strangled, this is one of them. Because interpretation is humbling. You can't show off. You can't add too much of yourself. You must disappear, so the message can travel through you. And that's the beginning of a terrifying pattern in his life. The more he grows spiritually, the more he is asked to disappear. Now the competitor, the enemy, stops being abstract. It becomes personal. It becomes the voice inside him saying, "You are wasting your life. You didn't study this hard to stand behind someone. You didn't fight hunger to become an errand man for religion. Do you know how stupid you look to your colleagues?" And that voice wasn't alone. Because in the real world, internal doubts usually find external allies. There were colleagues who didn't say it directly, but you could feel it in the way they looked at him. The slight curl of the lip, the polite distance, the hidden laughter. In certain circles, being too religious isn't just frowned upon. It's treated like intellectual self-harm. And then there were religious circles outside RCCG too, other streams of Christianity, other preachers, other movements. Some were more dramatic, more popular, more immediately rewarding. The kind that promises fast breakthroughs, quick wealth, instant deliverance. Religion like sugar, not medicine. Those were rivals too. Not because they necessarily attacked him personally at first, but because they competed for the same thing. The heart of Nigeria. And Nigeria's heart is not easily won. Nigerians are passionate, but they are also sharp-eyed. They can love you today and mock you tomorrow. They can crown you and then, when you slip, drag you through the mud with the same hands that lifted you. Adeboye was stepping into a world where spiritual leadership is one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. Not because of bullets, though sometimes, yes, but because of expectations. Because people don't come to pastors for small problems. They come with life-or-death desperation. They come with secrets. They come with shame. They come with hunger that can turn into worship or into hatred, depending on what they think you owe them. And somewhere in that swirl, Adeboye experienced a kind of conversion that wasn't cinematic, but was complete. He surrendered. Not in a weak way. In the way a proud man surrenders only when he realizes he's been outmatched by reality. He gave his life to Christ. Now, if you're expecting that to mean his life instantly became easier, you're about to understand why so many people respect him. Because the yes he gave to God immediately created a new war. The war was not God versus the devil in a cartoon sense. It was calling versus comfort. Because once he was inside the RCCG ecosystem, the demands intensified. Prayer meetings that didn't care about your sleep. Fasting that didn't care about your appetite. A moral code that didn't care about your excuses. Responsibilities that didn't care about your career calendar. The church wasn't asking him for Sunday attendance. It was asking him to be reshaped. And reshaping a grown man hurts. Spiritually, psychologically, socially. You lose old friends. You lose old pleasures. Sometimes you lose old respect, at least temporarily. There's a visual I want you to hold. A man in a modest room late at night, books open, some academic, some biblical. His eyes tired, his body hungry. His mind split between two kingdoms. The chalkboard world that celebrates him, and the prayer world that tries to break him. In that tension, the rival future keeps offering him a deal. Keep your faith private. Be a respectable Christian. Don't become one of those people. Stay safe. Stay impressive. But RCCG spirituality, especially in its older, holiness-driven form, didn't really do private. It demanded totality. And that's where the story gets sharp. Because Akindayomi, the founder, wasn't just leading a church. He was preparing a successor. Not in the obvious way, not with public speeches. More like a spiritual chess player watching a board, moving pieces quietly. Adeboye didn't see it yet. He saw himself as a helper, a translator, a servant. But the older man was watching the younger man's character. And character in ministry is not tested on stage. It's tested in hidden places. How you behave when nobody is praising you. What you do when power is offered. Whether you can keep your mouth shut when gossip is delicious. Whether you can obey when you disagree. That kind of test is brutal because you can't pass it with charisma, only with discipline. So while Adeboye's academic world gave him applause when he succeeded, the church world gave him silence. Sometimes not even a thank you, just more work. And that silence is where many people quit. But he didn't quit. Why? Because he had lived through the silence of poverty. He knew how to keep moving without compliments. Hunger had trained him for spiritual endurance. Now, here's a twist that makes his story even more gripping. His training in mathematics, the very thing that tempted him away from ministry, also became one of the reasons his ministry would later become so powerful. Mathematics trains you to think in systems, in structure, in consistency, in scalability. When he looked at prayer, he didn't just see emotion, he saw pattern. When he looked at spiritual discipline, he didn't just see tradition, he saw mechanism, habits that create outcomes. When he looked at people, he saw not just individual stories, but communities, networks, movements. In other words, he began to think like a builder. And builders always attract enemies, because builders change landscapes. As Adeboye's involvement deepened, the pressure around him increased. Some people in the church world may have wondered, who is this educated man? Can he be trusted? Is he here to take over? Is he too bookish to be spiritual? And from the other side, the academic world kept whispering, "You're throwing away your future." That's the rivalry at the center of this act. Not just him versus another preacher, but him versus the life he could have had. And the conflict becomes even more intense because both futures look righteous in their own way. Academic success could help Nigeria. It's honorable. It's clean. Spiritual leadership could help Nigeria too, but it's messy, dangerous, and it can destroy you if you become corrupt, or if people decide you owe them miracles. So what does a man do when both paths can be justified? He chooses the one that burns him, and he chose ministry. Not because it was easier, because it was heavier. And as soon as he chose it, he stepped into the place where all future leaders are formed, the place where obedience feels like death to ego. Akindayomi's trust in him grew, and with trust came proximity. With proximity came responsibility. The more Adeboye proved reliable, the more he was pulled into the engine room of the church, the behind-the-scenes discipline, the prayer culture, the counseling of broken people, the spiritual warfare language that sounds strange until you realize it's how millions of Nigerians describe the invisible battles they believe they're living. He learned to speak to pain without sounding like a politician. He learned to listen to stories that would make many men flinch. He learned to carry other people's grief without drowning in it. And here's the ugly part, the part that doesn't get celebrated in polished biographies. When people believe you are a man of God, they bring you their filth, not just their problems, their secrets, their shame, their addictions, their betrayals, the stuff they can't confess to their spouse, their friends, their parents. They bring it to you because they think you can handle it. And handling it can poison you if you're not careful. So Adeboye's spiritual formation wasn't just prayer and scripture. It was exposure to the raw underside of human life. That kind of exposure can either make you cynical or compassionate. He became known, quietly at first, as a man who did not laugh at people's wounds, a man who could be firm without being cruel, a man whose calm did not feel fake. And in Nigeria, where so many leaders, religious and political, are loud with promises, calm can become magnetic. Still, magnetism creates competition. Other voices began to rise in Nigeria's Christian landscape. Different styles, different emphases, some selling prosperity like a product, some turning spiritual authority into intimidation, some collecting followers like trophies. And within that loud marketplace, RCCG's strictness looked almost old-fashioned. Holiness, discipline, no shortcuts, long prayers. It wasn't sexy. It was demanding. And that's why it attracted the kind of people who wanted depth, not just drama. Adeboye was being shaped in a furnace that didn't care about trend, but he still didn't know what was coming. Because the ultimate twist of his life wasn't going to be a public scandal or a political battle. It was going to be succession, a kind of spiritual inheritance that would place him in front of millions, not behind an older man's shoulder, a transfer of weight so heavy it could crush an ordinary person. And you can feel the foreshadowing now. The disciplined academic who surrendered control, the translator who learned to disappear, the quiet servant who absorbed people's pain without feeding on it. He was being prepared for a moment when Nigeria would look at him and decide what he was worth. And Nigeria doesn't hand out reverence cheaply. In the next part, the private formation turns public. The quiet man steps forward. The church begins to expand. The rivals grow louder. The expectations become monstrous. And Adeboye's calm, once just a personality, becomes a weapon. When the old man's shadow finally began to recede, the room didn't get brighter. It got colder. Because one of the most misunderstood moments in spiritual movements is what happens when the founder's voice starts fading. People imagine a clean transfer, like a baton in a relay, applause, blessing, smooth continuity. But real succession is closer to a hospital corridor at midnight. Whispering, fear, hidden bargaining, rival eyes watching for weakness. And the thick, unspoken question nobody wants to ask out loud. If he's gone, who holds the power now? By the time Adeboye began stepping forward in a bigger way, RCCG was no longer just a small holiness church with intense prayer culture. It was becoming something else. An organism. A living network of souls, rules, hunger, and momentum. A movement that could either evolve into a global force or split into a dozen bitter fragments like broken glass. And that's where the enemy finally took a clear form. Not as a demon in a movie, as a competitor with a smile. A man, one of several, really. But let's focus on the archetype, rising through Nigeria's booming Christian scene. A preacher with a silk suit, a microphone voice, and the kind of charisma that makes people forget they ever had doubts. He didn't preach holiness like a narrow road. He preached success like a birthright. He didn't ask you to kneel. He asked you to claim. He didn't build discipline. He built desire. And Nigerians loved it. Because when a country is struggling, when inflation bites, when jobs evaporate, when corruption feels like the air you breathe, people don't just want sermons. They want escape. They want a story where suffering is temporary and victory is guaranteed. So this rival style exploded. It filled halls fast. It filled offering baskets faster. It created celebrity pastors who were treated like pop stars, bodyguards, convoys, flashing cameras, crowds screaming their names as, if salvation itself wore designer shoes. And suddenly, the question wasn't only, will Adeboye lead? It was, can his kind of faith survive this new Nigeria? Because Adeboye was the opposite of entertainment religion. He didn't sell God like a product. He treated God like a consuming fire. And that's not always popular. Now, here's what made the conflict vicious. The rival didn't have to attack Adeboye directly to hurt him. All he had to do was reshape people's expectations. If people got used to short services, Adeboye's long prayer meetings felt unbearable. If people got used to instant breakthroughs, Adeboye's discipline felt cruel. If people got used to pastors who flexed wealth, Adeboye's modesty looked like weakness. That's how a competitor wins without ever throwing a punch, by changing the rules of what people think power looks like. And for a while, it worked. Young Nigerians, especially in the cities, were hungry for new symbols. They wanted confidence, speed, spectacle. They wanted church that felt like a victory party, not a training camp. But Adeboye wasn't building a party. He was building an army. Not with guns. Nigeria has enough of those. With habits, with prayer, with systems. And if that sounds boring, let me show you what it looked like on the ground. Because in the heart of RCCG's culture, especially under Adeboye's expanding influence, worship was never just singing, it was atmosphere engineering. A deliberate emotional and spiritual progression that moved people from noise to surrender. The service would begin with praise, fast songs, clapping, bodies moving, the room warming like an engine starting. In Nigeria, music isn't decoration, it's a force. Drums and voices can carry a crowd the way a river carries debris, fast, unavoidable. And in those early moments, you could feel the stress leaving shoulders. People came in tight, guarded, angry at life. Then the rhythm hit them, and something loosened. But then, instead of keeping the energy high like a concert, the tone would shift. The songs would slow. The lights, if there were lights, would feel dimmer even if they weren't. The air would thicken. People would raise hands not because someone told them to, but because it felt like the correct posture in the presence of something larger. You'd see a businessman in a crisp shirt suddenly trembling like a child. You'd see a woman who looked unbreakable begin to cry silently, her face turned upward as if she was searching the ceiling for a door. And then the prayer. If you've never heard Nigerian prayer, you might not understand why outsiders sometimes get shocked. It can be loud, aggressive, like people are not asking God, but wrestling with heaven. Words become weapons. The room becomes a battlefield of voices. And for someone like Adeboye, quiet by nature, this is where his leadership became fascinating. He didn't lead prayer like a performer trying to hype a crowd. He led it like a general who knows exactly where he's taking you. He would give short, sharp prayer points, simple phrases that a crowd could repeat like a hammer. Father, let every chain break. Lord, let mercy speak. Every evil pattern end tonight. And you'd feel thousands of people hit the same emotional target at once. It's hard to describe what that does to a human mind. It's like standing inside a storm made of hope. Then came the preaching, the moment where his peculiar genius started changing everything. Adeboye didn't preach like a man drunk on his own voice. He preached like a teacher who had discovered a terrifying truth and felt responsible for your life. He was known for simplicity, stories, parables, everyday images, a pot on the fire, a stubborn goat, a broken bridge, a debt letter, a father waiting at the door. He wasn't trying to sound complicated, and that itself was a kind of power. Because Nigerians are used to leaders who prove intelligence by confusing you. Adeboye did the opposite. He made big ideas feel reachable. But don't mistake simple for soft. His messages could be gentle, and then suddenly cut like glass. He would talk about grace, then pivot into discipline. He would comfort the brokenhearted, then warn the careless. He would make you laugh, then make you suddenly aware of your own hypocrisy. And here's the twist most people miss. The quiet man's strongest weapon was not his volume. It was his control. In a country where noise is everywhere, traffic, politics, markets, arguments, control is rare. When Adeboye spoke calmly into a microphone, you could feel crowds quiet themselves. Not because he demanded it, but because the calm felt like authority. And authority draws both devotion and jealousy. The competitor, our rival archetype, noticed the shift. This holiness movement that should have stayed small was growing, not by flashy marketing, but by a strange mixture of prayer intensity and organizational precision. Because while other ministries were building a brand, RCCG under Adeboye was building a structure. Parishes multiplied, teams formed, leadership training expanded, standards were set, accountability tightened. The movement began to behave less like a loose revival and more like a disciplined network. And that's when the rivalry turned into a real war. Not a street fight, a war for souls, for credibility, for Nigeria's religious future. The rival strategy was seduction. God wants you rich now. Adeboye's strategy was formation. God wants you whole first. The rival offered quick comfort. Adeboye offered long transformation. But in the short term, quick comfort sells better. So the pressure increased. People compared. People criticized. Some accused him of being too strict. Some said his kind of Christianity was outdated. Some even tried to paint RCCG's discipline as control, as if holiness was a cage. And inside the church, another kind of competitor emerged too. Ambition. Because whenever a movement grows, opportunists appear like flies to fruit. Men who wanted influence. Women who wanted platforms. Leaders who wanted the title without the burden. People who loved the crowd's applause more than the quiet work of counseling. Broken people at 2A. Monsieur Adeboye had to fight that enemy as well. The enemy of internal corruption. And he did it in a way that shocked some people. He kept emphasizing humility. Again. And again. And again. Not because it sounded holy, but because he knew what Nigeria does to leaders. Nigeria can intoxicate you with praise until you believe you're a god. It can hand you a microphone and turn you into a tyrant if you're not disciplined. So he kept dragging the movement back toward its core. Prayer, holiness, obedience, service. Now, to keep tension climbing, let me show you one of the most visually striking arenas where his influence became undeniable. The massive gatherings, fields, auditoriums, highways thick with cars. People traveling overnight, some sleeping on bare ground, just to be present. Imagine headlights stretching like a glowing snake in the dark. Imagine buses packed so tightly that people's shoulders pressed together for hours. Imagine women with babies strapped to their backs. Men carrying plastic bags with food and small stools, entire families moving like pilgrims. And then imagine the sound when they arrive, a roar of voices singing in unison, like the country itself has started breathing the same rhythm. To an outsider, it can look fanatical. To Nigerians who have lived through uncertainty, it looks like the one place where order appears in the middle of chaos, a temporary city of worship. But those crowds created a new kind of danger. Expectation became a monster. When thousands of people gather because they believe you carry something, anointing, power, answers, then every silence becomes suspicious. Every delay feels like failure. Every unanswered prayer becomes a potential accusation. And that's where many leaders crack. Some start faking miracles. Some start manipulating emotions. Some start promising what they can't deliver. Some start turning the crowd into a personal ATM. This is how men of God become predators. Adeboye's restraint here is part of why he is revered. He didn't build his reputation mainly on spectacle. Yes, people around him reported healings, breakthroughs, miracles. Nigeria is full of such testimonies across many churches, but his public posture was often cautious, pointing away from himself, emphasizing God, emphasizing repentance, emphasizing prayer and obedience. That posture made him harder to attack, because you can accuse a flamboyant preacher of showmanship. But how do you accuse a man whose brand is modesty and discipline? The rival tried anyway, through insinuation, through whispers, through subtle comparisons. The rival's followers would say, "Our pastor is more modern. Our pastor is more powerful. Our pastor is richer. Look, God has proven him." And Adeboye's followers would respond, "Power is not a car. Power is a changed life. That clash became a cultural fault line in Nigeria's Christianity: spectacle versus structure, instant gratification versus long obedience. And then came another twist, one that would make even the competitor pause. RCCG's expansion beyond Nigeria. It didn't stay local. It didn't stay tribal. It didn't stay regional. The movement began appearing in cities across the world, places with cold winters and skeptical populations, places where the Nigerian style of prayer looked startling. And yet it grew, because diaspora Nigerians carried their faith like luggage, and RCCG gave them a familiar language in foreign lands. Prayer that sounded like home, discipline that felt like identity, and leadership that seemed stable. This global spread changed Adeboye's role. He was no longer just a Nigerian pastor. He became a symbol of African Christianity's ability to export itself, not just import Western forms. A symbol that Nigeria's spiritual energy could build institutions, not just moments. That symbol status did something else too. It made politicians pay attention. And whenever politicians pay attention to a religious leader, a dangerous courtship begins. Because politicians want endorsement. They want legitimacy. They want crowds. They want the emotional trust that pastors hold. And pastors, if they are not careful, can become tools or kings behind the curtain. Adeboye's balancing act became more difficult. Stay spiritual. Avoid becoming a political puppet. Yet remain relevant in a country where politics affects everything from fuel to safety. This is where his quietness again became strategic. He often maintained a careful public posture, not easily pinned down, not easily dragged into overt partisan brawls. At least not in a way that would swallow the church whole. But even careful men can be pulled. Nigeria has a way of pulling everyone. So the competitor adapted. If he couldn't beat Adeboye on discipline, he could beat him on glamour. If he couldn't beat him on stability, he could beat him on spectacle. And for a moment, it looked like that might work. Because humans are humans, and glamour is addictive. Then Adeboye did something that didn't look dramatic, but was devastating in the long game. He kept building. Not just crowds, systems, leadership pipelines, training structures. A standardized parish model. A culture where replication was possible without losing identity. That is the mathematics mind showing itself again. Scalability. And scalability beats charisma over time. Because charisma dies with the charismatic person. But a system can outlive you. This is why, by this stage of his life, Adeboye was no longer merely preaching sermons. He was shaping a machine of faith, one that could carry his spiritual emphases across continents and decades. And that's also why Nigerians began to revere him in a specific way, not just as a miracle worker or a motivational speaker, but as a patriarch of a disciplined spiritual empire. Still, reverence always has a shadow side. When people call you daddy, they don't just love you. They also project onto you. They want you to be perfect. They want you to be untouchable. They want you to be the answer to problems you didn't create. That's the final pressure cooker of this part of the story. Adeboye had to remain human in a culture that rewards turning leaders into idols. And the irony is brutal. The same crowd that celebrates you today can crucify you tomorrow if their expectations aren't met. So the real question driving the tension into the next act isn't whether he can preach well, or build well, or lead well. It's this. Can he carry the weight of being revered without becoming corrupted by it? Because the competitor isn't only outside, the competitor is inside. Pride, fatigue, temptation, the subtle voice whispering, "You deserve this. You earned this. You are special." And if that voice ever wins, the story ends ugly. But if he keeps it under control, then what comes next is not just a life story. It's a legacy story. The final turn. How a living man becomes a lasting symbol, how he navigates age, succession fears, criticism, devotion, and the looming reality that even the most powerful spiritual leaders eventually face. The end of the road. The strangest enemy that ever tried to dethrone Pastor Enoch Adeboye didn't preach in another church. It didn't wear a suit. It didn't need a microphone. It was time. Because there comes a moment in every spiritual movement, especially one built around a living patriarch, when people stop asking, "What does he believe?" and start asking the question they're ashamed to admit, "What happens when he is gone?" And in Nigeria, that question is never neutral. It's not just curiosity. It's economics. It's influence. It's inheritance. It's fear. It's the kind of question that can split a church, scramble loyalties, and turn friends into rivals who suddenly remember old grievances. Adeboye, by this stage, is no longer just a pastor in a pulpit. He is a symbol people have wrapped their hopes around. They call him Daddy G. Oh, with a softness that sounds like family. They speak his name in taxis, on campuses, in offices, in markets. Some say it with reverence. Some say it with suspicion. Some say it like a password. But here's the secret. The higher you rise, the more your life becomes a canvas for other people's projections. They don't just watch you. They use you, sometimes lovingly, sometimes violently, to explain their own reality. So the later phase of Adeboye's life isn't only about sermons and massive gatherings. It's about survival under worship. Because being revered is not the same as being loved. Reverence can be hungry. It can demand more than a human being can give. And the rival ministries, those glittering, modern, high-volume competitors, understood something ugly. If they couldn't beat Adeboye, spiritually in the eyes of the public, they could try to beat him biologically, outlast him, wait him out, let old age do the work. They didn't always say it openly, but you could feel it in the way the ecosystem shifted. New stars rising, new voices dominating the youth, new movements sprinting, ahead with marketing and spectacle. Some wanted to inherit his audience. Some wanted to inherit his moral authority. Some wanted to inherit the cultural space he occupied in Nigeria's imagination. And then came the moment that looked, to outsiders, like a crack in the wall. A sudden resignation storyline that rippled through the news cycle and through whispers in pews. A governance controversy, regulations, public confusion. For the first time, many ordinary Nigerians tasted a hard truth they don't like to face. Even giant churches exist inside a nation, with laws, politics, and pressure. Adeboye's response wasn't a fiery revolt. He didn't launch a dramatic public war. He did something that felt almost irritatingly calm. He adjusted, clarified, repositioned, keeping the movement from being swallowed by the drama. And that calm was not weakness. It was leadership. Because in Nigeria, the quickest way to destroy a movement is to let its leader become reactive, angry, defensive, impulsive. Adeboye didn't give his rivals that gift. Still, even if a man handles political storms with caution, he can't negotiate with the one storm that always wins: aging. At a certain age, your body becomes a daily reminder that you are not infinite. You can still lead, still speak, still pray. But the world notices the small changes. A slower walk, a longer pause before words, a careful step, a moment where the crowd's roar is loud enough to swallow your breath. And the crowd reacts to that in two contradictory ways. One half becomes more tender. Protect him. Pray for him. Don't stress him. The other half becomes more predatory. Who's next? Who benefits? Who's positioning? That second half is where rumors breed. Succession rumors, conspiracy theories, spiritual prophecies people throw around like stones, names whispered as heirs, names attacked as traitors, people reading every facial expression like it's a coded message. In the middle of that, Adeboye is dealing with something more intimate than public pressure. The private fear of any leader who has built something enormous. Did I build this for God, or did it quietly become mine? That question is brutal, because it exposes temptation not as an obvious sin, but as a slow drift. A movement can start as sacrifice and end as ego. It happens so often that people almost expect it. This is why his later years are the real test of why Nigerians honor him. Not because he grew RCCG, that's impressive, yes, but because the longer he stayed in power, the more opportunities he had to become exactly what Nigerians hate: a religious emperor, drunk on control, surrounded by yes-men, insulated from accountability. And yet his public image, especially among his devoted followers, remained anchored in something that felt stubbornly old school: humility, discipline, prayer. People loved telling the story of his early poverty, the image of a brilliant boy from a humble village, so poor that basic things many take for granted were delayed in his life. That story became more than biography. It became a moral symbol Nigerians could cling to. A man who knows hunger is less likely to mock your hunger. But the same symbol also created a new danger: sainthood. Because when people treat you like a saint, they stop allowing you to be human. They stop allowing you to be wrong. They stop allowing you to rest. They want you to be a living proof that God is real. And a living proof is a heavy assignment. So in those later years, you see a subtle transformation in the way he carries himself. Not loud, not performative. More like a man who understands that every public appearance now has two audiences: the crowd in front of him and the future studying him. How do you know? Because the real power of a legacy is not what you do while you're alive. It's what keeps moving when you're tired. The structure he built, parishes, leadership layers, training culture, became its own statement. This is bigger than one man, and that message mattered, because Nigeria has seen too many movements collapse when the founder falls sick, dies, or loses control. Too many churches split into factions like siblings fighting over inheritance. Too many sons turning into enemies because the throne is empty. If Adeboye had wanted to, he could have made himself the center of everything, forcing every decision to pass through him, making the church unable to breathe without his permission. But RCCG's expansion, its replication model, its ability to keep functioning across nations, those are signs of something else. A system that's designed to outlive its icon. Now, this is where we face the part you asked for. Death. Not as an event we can announce like a date on a calendar, but as a shadow that starts shaping decisions long before the final breath. In many Nigerian Christian cultures, leaders speak about death with strange confidence, sometimes even with a kind of theatrical certainty, because they believe life is spiritual warfare and they want to show fearlessness. Followers love that. It reassures them. Our leader is not afraid. But inside a man, inside any man, there is still the quiet human moment at night when the crowd is gone, the microphones are off, and the body reminds you, you will not always be here. And that reality does something. It forces you to decide what you truly want to leave behind. Not buildings, not titles. A pattern, a standard, a spiritual DNA. This is where Adeboye's legacy becomes clearer and more controversial. Because what does RCCG export into the world? It exports prayer that is intense, direct, sometimes aggressive, faith as a fight. It exports discipline, fasting, holiness language, moral seriousness. It exports a certain optimism that many associate with prosperity teaching, the belief that God can bless materially, not only spiritually. It exports a Nigerian form of Christianity that doesn't ask permission to exist in Western cities. It simply arrives, loud with worship, confident in its identity. To supporters, that is liberation. African Christianity refusing to be a side character. To critics, it can look like a machine. Too structured, too ambitious, too big, too comfortable with power and money. And there were moments when Adeboye's public statements on social issues, on gender roles, on giving, sparked backlash, debate, even mockery from those who already distrusted religious authority. But here's the twist that kept him standing. Criticism rarely destroyed his influence, because his followers didn't love him only for his words. They loved him for the image of stability he represented in a country that often feels unstable. When Nigeria shakes, people look for something that doesn't shake. A church with consistent rhythm, weekly services, monthly gatherings, predictable spiritual practices, can become more than a place of worship. It becomes an emotional shelter. And Adeboye's personal style, calm, steady, not addicted to shouting, made the shelter feel safer. That's why his recognition in Nigeria isn't just religious, it's cultural. He became part of the national atmosphere, the way certain musicians, certain politicians, certain activists become fixtures. You don't have to agree with them to feel their presence, and that cultural presence feeds back into reverence. Even Nigerians who don't attend RCCG often know the name Adeboye as a symbol of Pentecostal power in Nigeria. It's said with a mixture of respect and suspicion, the classic Nigerian combination. I'm not sure about all this, but that man is not small. Now remember the rival competitor, the glamour preacher, the spectacle empire. Time did something to that rivalry. It didn't erase it. It exposed it. Because charisma is loud, but it's also fragile. It burns hot, but it can burn out. Scandals, splits, money controversies, personality cult drama, many flashy movements suffer the same fate. They expand fast, and then collapse in a mess that stinks for years. Adeboye's lane was different. Slow-burning, system-building, discipline-driven. So even when rivals surged, his movement kept widening, quietly, relentlessly. And that created an unexpected reversal. The competitor's greatest weapon, speed, became the thing that made them unstable. Adeboye's greatest weakness, slowness, became the thing that made him durable. That durability is one reason people honor him. Nigerians respect what survives. But then comes the final emotional twist of legacy. A leader like Adeboye becomes so significant that people stop seeing him as a man and start seeing him as a spiritual weather system. They look for his yearly declarations. They analyze his words for national meaning. They interpret his tone like it's a forecast. And in a country where many people feel powerless, a spiritual forecast feels like control. Even when people disagree with him, they still listen. Because listening is a way of staying oriented. This is why, in his later stage, the role of Adeboye is not merely preacher. He is a reference point. And reference points are dangerous, because if they fall, a lot of people feel like the ground itself has collapsed. So, what is the real legacy he leaves even while alive? Not the myth that he is perfect, but the reality that he built a model. A Nigerian-led global church movement that is organized, replicable, culturally confident, and anchored in a heavy prayer culture. He also leaves behind a psychological legacy, the idea that a quiet, disciplined, academically trained man can become a spiritual giant without turning into a clown, a dictator, or a spectacle merchant. That idea matters in Nigeria because Nigerians are tired of being manipulated by loud people, religious and political alike. A calm leader feels like relief. At the same time, the shadow legacy, the one critics whisper about, will also travel. Debates about prosperity teaching, questions about mega church power, tension between tradition and modern values, and the fear that any massive religious institution can become too influential to challenge. That's the honest shape of a legacy. It's not one clean story. It's a complex footprint. And here is the final image I want you to see. Not a funeral, not a headline, not a dramatic end, but something more fitting for a man like Adeboye. A giant prayer ground at night. Thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, standing under open sky. Some with eyes closed, some with hands raised, some crying silently because they don't even have words left. The air thick with singing that moves like a wave, the sound of hope colliding with fear, a nation's private pain poured into public worship. And somewhere on a stage, an older man stands, not trying to look young, not trying to compete with the new stars, not trying to perform. He speaks calmly into a microphone, and the crowd quiets. Not because they are hypnotized, but because they are hungry for something stable. That's what Nigerians honor in him. Not just miracles, not just scale, not just the stories. They honor the feeling that, in a country that changes violently and unpredictably, there is at least one voice that has remained, remarkably consistent. Calling people to pray, to endure, to believe the unseen is real, and to keep walking even when life smells like diesel and rot and disappointment. Time is still coming for him, the way it comes for everyone. But his true victory over time is this. He didn't build something that ends with his breath. He built something designed to keep breathing after him.